Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey. On this show, we will be exploring the issues faced by men and boys everywhere. Your host, Erin Pizzey, opened the first ever domestic violence refuge for battered women and children in Chiswick, England. What she found, however, was that many of the women coming into her shelter were as violent as the men they were fleeing. Over the years, she also tried to create resources and safe spaces for men as well as women, but frequently met with indifference and hostility to men's suffering.
For so many years, feminists have been able to demonize men under their artificial argument called patriarchy. Hi, I'm Erin Pizzey, and through working with battered women in my refuges, I saw for myself how family violence is passed on from one generation to the next. Quite simply, violent behavior is often carried forward into adult relationships. Family violence is not a gender issue, and never was. It's a generational issue. Feminists have had people believe that men are responsible for all the violence in our society. There is sufficient evidence that both men and women can be equally violent in their personal relationships.
The truth is that men and boys are not privileged in our society, but are often marginalised, disadvantaged and ignored. Welcome to Revelations with Erin Pizzey and her co-host, Dean Esme.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the Saturday, March 29th, 2014 episode of Revelations with Erin Pizzey. I am your co-host, as per usual, Dean Esme. Nice to see you all here on a Saturday afternoon / evening / morning, wherever it is. We do have listeners all around the world. And with me, as always, your host, Erin Pizzey. Say hello to everybody, Erin.
Hello, it's the most gorgeous spring day here in London.
Oh, is it?
Yep.
Glad to hear it. The weather here in Michigan is still kind of dreary. Well, there's no snow, so there is that. How's things been going for you the last couple of weeks, Erin?
Wonderfully. Really, really happy.
Are you coming back to the U.S. soon?
I'm coming back to see you, Dean.
Excellent. In June, right?
Yeah, I'm coming to Detroit.
Yeah, we're having the first International Men's and Boys Conference in Detroit, Michigan, in the United States, and
that is really exciting. And then I'm going to Canada first to join Attila's conference on domestic violence because I am half Canadian.
That's in early June.
Yeah, and then I'll be down to see you, all of you. I'm so looking forward to it.
I'm looking forward to it too. It's the first conference of its time and of its kind, and we have many, many, many people from around the world will be there. Also, I want to just take a moment to remind people that A Voice for Men is running its quarterly fundraiser. It will be until at least April 1st. If you go to the front page of avoiceformen.com, we could use your help. $5, $50, $5,000. Every little bit helps to keep doing these radio shows and YouTube videos and the articles and the publications and all that. Every little bit helps us keep doing what we're doing. So in any case, Erin, today we have a special guest, one that we've been wanting to talk to for the longest time.
Yes, indeed.
Nicola Graham-Kevan, Dr. Nicola Graham-Kevan, I believe. She is a reader in the psychology of aggression at the University of Central Lancashire. And I understand she is also professor of clinical psychology at, I'm going to say this very badly, Mitt-Universitet, Sweden?
Yes, Mid-Sweden.
And there she is. Good morning, Dr. Kevan. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Can we call you Nicola?
Yeah, or Nikki.
Or Nikki even. All right, yeah. Dr. Nikki. Excellent. Now, Nikki here, Dr. Kevan, you are. Let's start with just a few questions that are to break the ice. You are a reader in the psychology of aggression at the University of Central Lancashire, which is in England, I assume.
Yes, it's in the north of England.
A lot of our Americans won't know what a reader is. What is a reader?
It's so in England. Our threshold for for professor is really, really high. And so where you get a professorship elsewhere, you get a readership in England. And then about 2 years later, if you carry on performing, you get professorship. So it's sort of like a step on to professor, but not quite there in England. So.
But you're a full professor at this Mid-Sweden University.
Yes, I am.
How does that happen? How did you make your way to Sweden?
My colleagues at Mid-Sweden were conducting a European survey on domestic violence, and they consulted me, and we got sort of like chatting and so forth. And we carried on in communication, and then they invited me over. And I didn't know I was being interviewed for the job, but I was. And anyway, they must have been happy enough because they offered me the, guest researcher, and they wanted to put me forward for professor, which had to go to a committee and everything. And I got that. So, yes, I go and work a little bit over in Sweden, which is lovely.
I'm actually a little surprised to hear that you were welcomed in Sweden. Now, A Voice for Men, in case anybody's curious, does have a Swedish edition with things written in the Swedish language. If anybody's curious about that, just search online for A Voice for Men Sweden. But what we've heard is that, it's se.avoiceformen.com, se. AVFM Svjerge, I think I'm saying that right. So if anybody's curious about that, there's plenty of articles written in Swedish on A Voice for Men. But one of the things I'm curious about, Nikki, is that we've read a lot of stories about a lot of hostility toward male victims of domestic violence, or the whole idea that there is a significant problem of male victims there, but yet they welcomed you. Yes,
it is interesting. It does seem that feminism is quite strong in Sweden, but certainly on my dealings day to day with people, they seem to be far more focused on equality. The people you work with, and certainly the people who I work with predominantly in Sweden, which is Joachim Sars and Orion Sundin, both of those are, they're psychologists, so they follow the evidence, they don't follow the ideology.
So, and now I know this will be a subject that gets right to the heart of the matter, or at least with Erin. There is a problem with feminist denial about female aggression and in general, isn't there? Absolutely,
yes. And female, when they do accept female aggression, there's a problem with the explanations they choose to give for that aggression as well.
Well, now, from what I understand, you've published a few peer-reviewed papers. I know that Professor Don Dutton had spoken well of you. He's with the University of British Columbia. A couple of other people have mentioned your work to me. But you've done both research work and clinical work, right?
Yes, that's right.
And you basically do agree that when it comes right down to it, domestic violence is not a gendered issue? Would that be a fair way of putting it?
Absolutely. Certainly all the good data, all the robust studies, particularly the longitudinal cohort studies, meta-analyses by John Archer, all find that, it's roughly equal rates for men and women. And the British Crime Survey finds the same thing, Stats Canada does, the family violence surveys in the US. All the reliable data. If you want to find data to support a feminist view, you have to look at small, selected samples research, which does not generalize to, a population.
And this is nothing we haven't heard on this show before. And it's something, Erin, you've always believed to be true, all going back to the 70s, isn't it?
Well, in 1971, as women poured into the refuge, it was very obvious that, I keep saying this, of the 100 that came in, 62 were violent themselves and violent to their children, 62%. And I know from personal experience, because my mother was violent. What I can say is because I looked at each woman and her history, and I also checked back to her parents and her grandparents, and it's very obvious that it's generational. It's a family issue. But we've got a ridiculous situation now where right across the world, as Nicola says, the robust research, proves beyond doubt that it is not a gender issue. But you have in power, right across the Western world, sufficiently radical feminists who will push the ideology. And Nicola, what devastates me after 40 years is how are we going to change the mindset of the people who run the governments? Because they're not listening to the evidence.
No. Unfortunately, certainly the UK government hasn't got a very good track record of listening to evidence about, on a number of subjects, have they? Culling badgers and all sorts of things, which obviously we're not going to discuss today. What I noticed from working with practitioners and police, people who are involved in the refuges for women and so forth, is there is a definite movement, the grassroots movement, the people who are actually dealing with the call-outs, with the people who are identified as victims or perpetrators. There's a definite shift in the UK now, and far more police are amenable to the idea that, there's a lot of mutual aggression, but women are violent. Also, I've had contact from women's refuges asking, we have programs for women's violence, and have we got any programs for male victims? So, I really do feel there's been a drive, that it's starting to change.
Well, it really is not before time, because the thing that has always upset me from the very beginning of this is my parents, and in other people's cases, as children, you can say, at least they had the choice of each other. We as children had no choice, so we had no childhood. And in a sense, we were patterned to repeat what we had learned in our early childhood. And now we know within the womb from what was happening. I mean, because it isn't much of a leap of imagination to recognize that the chemicals of fear and rage will affect the unborn baby just as much as a drink or alcohol.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been reading up on the impact of adverse childhood experience and what happens to children, while they're in gestating in the womb and so forth. And the research from animal models, rats, mice and everything, but primate models and humans is really quite clear that, the effect of stress, even while you're, actually a fetus, has far-reaching effects on the way your body responds to stress, how quickly you perceive threat. Neurologically, it changes how the brain is and how you respond, and that is a burden for people. Who the children who grow up with these, that's a burden that they have to carry for their whole lives.
Now, this interests me. Go ahead.
Okay. No, it's okay.
Well, this interests me because Erin has mentioned this several times, but we've never had a researcher actually confirm that there's studies which show that domestic violence in the home, intimate partner violence, screaming, yelling, hitting, that sort of thing, while a woman is pregnant, can actually damage the development of that child, even in utero, let alone after birth. So you're saying there's genuine clinical evidence or peer-reviewed studied evidence to back that view up, Dr. Kevan?
Yes, they're not specific to domestic violence, because obviously there are animal models. What they know is that if you stress a pregnant mother, which results in any sort of stress, particularly, quite severe stress that human fetuses may be subjected to, but even milder stress, such as bombarding a primate with noise for a few minutes a day over a 3-week period, that is enough for when the babies of that primate are born. They actually are neurologically different. They respond to stress differently, and these changes endure. Now, the animal models are consistent with what we see in the clinical literature and what we see clinically with people who have had these adverse childhoods. The thing with the animal models, and as a vegetarian, I do have a bit of a difficulty with how these have been run and the ethics of them all. But the findings are quite clear that very early, even pre-birth, and those first few years of life for the human, or first few weeks for sort of rats and so forth, are absolutely crucial in developing how that person or creature will respond to stress throughout their lives.
I suppose that shouldn't surprise anybody.
No.
Yet, I don't know, some would somehow consider it controversial, but it only makes sense to me. What about you, Erin?
When one of the first things I noticed of the pregnant mothers coming into the refuge, almost the first thing she'd say, because she'd have come in as a result of a violent incident, is, "I'm worried about my baby, it's not moving." And I'd say to her, "Look, just don't worry, the baby's as frightened as you are. All you need to do, we'll check you." We took her to the local hospital and just brought her back. It's 3 days of peace and safety, and your baby will feel safe enough to move. You know, one of the things I also noticed, these were the babies, because our mothers used to give birth at Queen Charlotte's Hospital in London, and obviously I used to visit, but those were the babies that actually, once they were born, were extremely lethargic, and it took a lot of effort when we took them back to the refuge to keep them actually moving and awake. It was almost as though the only safety they knew is when they were almost comatose.
Interesting. Yeah.
I know, because yeah, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say that, you see, one of the things that is so difficult with all this is that I don't think domestic violence cases, where the domestic violence is generational, which most of it is, it's not only generational, it's also consensual, so both the people are involved.
Absolutely.
The majority of people I've dealt with who are seriously violent are also mostly have personality disorders. And there's no amount of courts that are ever going to stop them. You can make as many laws as you like. People who are violent with disability, with serious disabilities due to their childhood patterning, there's no injunction that'll stop them. I've just been talking this afternoon to a young woman who was knocked senseless by her partner. And when I began to talk to her, the partner before him knocked her senseless, and the partner before that knocked her senseless. And the question I said is, the first time, it can be careless, it's a mistake. The second time, it's unfortunate, but the third time, you really must look at why you need to make these painful relationships, physically, emotionally painful relationships. And that's not the sort of work that you'll get these days, because she'll be told she's a victim, and actually she's not.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I've worked with victims, and what's upsetting is often, by the time I've worked with them, they're actually going through the family court system, and the courts are seeking to take a child off them. They've often already got one or two children that have been taken off them and put into care, and it's because the attitude of the social workers and everybody else is, she's a domestic violence victim, we need to rescue her, and just by saying, right, quick, run, come with us, you'll be safe, then in their minds, therefore she's now safe, she's rescued. But, there's this inability, it seems, to actually recognise that often victims, do bring something to the table. Many of them have got the same upbringing as the perpetrators, which is this traumatic, neglectful upbringing, and it leaves them vulnerable to this repeat victimisation from one relationship to the next. And you're right when you say once is unlucky. I mean, the research, there isn't a lot, but the little there is suggests that, women have had more than one, so 2 or more domestic violence relationships, start showing like higher adverse childhood experiences, higher sort of personality issues and so forth. So, I think we need to see that the help that's needed to female victims, and it would be the same for male victims, is often, unless it's a one-off, it's often more complicated than just, throwing them a life ring and saying, climb aboard, we'll rescue you. It's not appropriate because these people have complex needs which we're not addressing.
Well, that's one of the things that was so heartbreaking, because what I did, because as you can imagine, I had absolutely no funding because I'd broken the law so many times. But one of the things we did, because we were this huge squatting agency, we took empty houses belonging to the different London boroughs, and put our own mothers and kids in them and created communities, big communities. Say you'd have 5 mothers and 15 kids, something like that. And we'd houses all over London, to say nothing of a massive hotel, which was a community of ours. This gave women sometimes 2 or 3 years before they were ready to be rehoused in that area. In that time, they had time to actually look at themselves. There was staff, most and always male staff. Half the staff were male, and the children had access to treatment that they badly needed, and the mothers themselves were actually part of a relearning process. You know, one of the things about coming from a violent family, it's totally asocial. You don't learn anything except the rule of the boot and the fist. And then you choose whether you're going to be the boot and the fist, which was my choice. And my sister was the one who essentially hibernated. So she ended up with the migraines and all the various illnesses that come with that. And my feeling is that they closed all my programs down, of course, because one of the things that was happening at the time was the emerging feminist movement, and they wanted the cause and they wanted the money. So we're facing, in all the evidence that we can provide, an enormous ideological billion-dollar business. And how do you unpin it?
No, I absolutely agree. I mean, once there's an old saying, never get betwixt a beast and its meat. And it's the idea that, you know, that's what we're doing. We're literally getting between the beast, feminism, and its meat, which is its funding. And, you know, what happens when you do get between the beast and its meat is you often get aggression. And that's certainly, I know, you've had awful experiences, haven't you? And I've had some quite hostile experiences. Nothing on the level that you've experienced, but then
so did Murray Straus. Murray Straus and also Susan Steinmetz almost gave up because her whole family was threatened. And Richard Geddes. There wasn't anybody who wasn't threatened because we were talking about big sums of money.
This is something I'll repeat just in the case we've got new listeners. We're on a new platform. Not everybody's familiar. The show and all of the different researchers like Dr. Kevan here and many, many others confirm overwhelmingly that the vast majority of domestic violence is consensual. It's both parties being violent. Men are about as likely to be victims as women are. There's room for debating around the edges as to who gets the worst hurt physically, but even that's up for some debate. Dr. Kevan is just confirming all this, and I also get people who say, I'm a conspiracy theorist if I say feminists are a problem here, but they aren't they, ladies?
Well, yes, I mean, it's but don't you think, Nicola, I mean, it's like it's almost like an evangelical religion, feminism.
Yeah.
It's something that it's rather like when you're a young child. I remember being drummed out of the brownies. And you get drummed out if you disagree with this particular form of born-again religion. Yes,
I mean, the cognitive psychology research is interesting here. They've not looked at feminism per se. It's something I have in the back of my mind to do one day. But they've looked at people's political beliefs, you know, where they've got the ideology rather than just following, you know, what parties meeting their needs at the moment. And you've got some ideologically political people, particularly in the US, I think. And the research suggests that where somebody has an ideology, it acts as a filter right at the very start. So they cannot process information, you know, without it going through this filter. So, you know, even with the best will in the world, somebody who has a belief system, an ideological belief system around feminism, just is unable to actually process that information without a massive effort, which obviously is often lacking, because cognitively they filter so quickly that they interpret it in such a way that, you know, it isn't evidence at all to them. They just sort of like, you know, they're so very critical, and certainly some people do it willfully. They suppress data and everything else, and they are dishonest players, and they probably are the funder-hungry people. But, you know, there's some very genuine people who are very feminist, and I think they actually, you know, do suffer from this bias that really is precognitive. You know, before they have time to think about it, it's already been distorted by this mindset that they have.
It's a bit like Scientology, isn't it? You see, what people didn't realise, and I don't know because I'm 75 now, so I was there at the very beginning, and I was there when we were all being organised Now, it just so happens that my father and mother were captured by communists in Tin Sin. So even though I was politically naive, I knew an awful lot about communism because we didn't see them for 3 years. And then the resulting, So first thing that happened is when you sent your £3.10 in, you got this magazine called Shrew, and they contacted you and told you where in your local area there was a group, and it's a women's liberation group, and you went there for your first meeting. And then thereafter, each person was asked to invite their friends to their own house and create groups, women's liberation groups they were called in those days. And then you had a head honcho lady coming from the head office in Shaftesbury Avenue, London, who then explained to us that we were oppressed, that marriage was a dangerous place for women and children. We were oppressed, our enemies were our husbands, and that we were to meet in these groups and discuss our oppression. Now, this is exactly what they were doing in China and Russia. They're re-educating your thinking. So imagine how powerful that was for quite a lot of very vulnerable young married women. And it was seen as incredibly glamorous, the whole of that early days of the women's liberation movement. It was in all the newspapers. It was something you had to be. It was radical chic if it popped for anything else. But what it did attract was a huge amount of women who had personal problems of their own, which then they had to make political. That was the big slogan. So if your dad was a shit, then every man was a shit.
Yeah.
And that's the way it went. And you see, now we're talking 40 years later.
And still, it winds up being, scientifically, I don't believe it's even controversial anymore. Domestic violence is not a gendered issue. It's all about fighting ideology and getting governments to recognize, giving governments and the general populace to recognize reality from, I'm going to say it, feminist fantasy, but also conservative fantasy. There's this conservative mentality some people have that women are helpless and weak and all that. And you got to get past that cultural bias too. But let me say or ask something a little more controversial, because I'll bet you both have views on this. We say it's not a gender issue. Domestic abuse is not a gendered issue. Now, what we typically mean by that is men and women are about equally likely to be victims, and they're about equally likely to be perpetrators, right? Treatment models. I'm wondering about treatment models, and if either of you see a difference in what men need versus what women need.
I don't.
No.
I think you'd have to run the refuges differently. I always was this is why when in the very early days of the refuge movement, I tried to open a house for men. Why didn't I take men into the refuge as well as women? It would not have been a good idea. If you're looking at 62% of the women who were violent themselves, adding men to the mix would have been an impossible situation. And so my feeling is that to begin with, you need to actually run the two programs, in a sense, differently. You'll have more problems, and I certainly did with the men's house, because men are not used to getting together and helping each other out personally. They're very good at helping each other out financially or any of those other things, but the first men that came into the men's house disappeared behind the front doors of their various bedrooms and didn't come out. And the idea that they should be running the place themselves, cleaning, washing, cooking, as we expected from the women, really didn't happen, which is one of the reasons why. And apart from the fact, I couldn't get any funding from anybody for men, and you still can't today.
That's definitely the case.
Yeah.
I applied for funding, and I've recently got a European grant to look at victims of violent crime. And, it all but completely, by the wording, is every sort of category of person, so women, children, ethnic minorities, gay, lesbian, trans, immigrated people, older women. It's like the only person who isn't under their little catch-all is men, which is fantastically interesting, considering men are more likely to be killed, in every society, in every culture throughout all of history, more likely to be, assaulted and everything else. I mean, men are, the world victims of violence. Looking outside domestic violence, men are far more likely to be killed and injured than women, and yet nobody seems to care at all,
Yeah, Nicola, one of the things, too, I've always said in the refuge, so I was taking in, at the height of it all, around 1,000 mothers and kids a year, and I was seeing virtually all of them. And it was very interesting to notice how very self-sufficient. It doesn't mean they hadn't been damaged. The girls had been as damaged in many ways as the boys, but it was the boys who were most affected by the violence in the family, and particularly when the mother was violent. And it bears up now, because I see an awful lot of my children who are now in their 40s and 50s, and how many of the girls are managing very well, and how many of the boys haven't been able to. Do you notice any difference when you're working with men as well as women?
Nikki?
We've lost her.
We've lost her. Oh, no. Oh, no. We have lost her. I will try calling her back now. Just try talking a little bit, and I'll try and get her back on the line, guys.
Okay. Yeah, if to go on with that conversation, one of the hardest things for children, boys or girls, is to know that one or other parent or both didn't want you. And that is something that...
Hello, Nikki. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm back. Yeah, I got disconnected.
Good. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what happened there, but we've got you back. Erin was just talking about how in terms of aftercare, years later, she's generally found that the women tend to be doing better than the men are. Which leads me back to my question. I mean, you sort of you answered it and said no, but I'm going to push you a little harder. Is there some possibility that men may need a somewhat different approach to recovering and moving on to these situations, as a rule of thumb? I'm very curious about that.
I think probably where men have a harder time recovering from being a victim, and possibly a perpetrator, often because the two are not mutually exclusive, will be around the initiation of social support, emotional support. And men are just generally, from very small children, there's a difference in verbal ability and so forth. There's evolutionary reasons why men may be more hardwired to, sort of deny emotional experience and so forth. So, yeah, I mean, there certainly are possibly additional difficulties that a man may have, but regarding sort of the core risk factors for male or female perpetrators or victims, I would say most of it is centering around, as Erin said before, about the high rates of personality disorder, and that's with victims and perpetrators. What we know about these sort of cohort is that they find it very hard to regulate their own emotional experience. They have very poor stress tolerance, and often because of this adverse experience, which has sensitized them. So I would say, in treating perpetrators and victims, I wouldn't see any need for a gendered approach at that level, because what I would be seeking to do, and I've got a program running in a prison in Manchester, in England, where we're working with male perpetrators, but it's what we do is we seek to build up those skills of emotional awareness and recognition using sort of mindfulness and radical acceptance of his clinical techniques. We build all of those core skills often that these men never learned as children, and then they're able to then actually look at their offending and actually understand why it happened in a way that they never had been before. And I don't think that is gendered. I think I've seen it in female clients who are violent, and I've seen it in male clients as well.
Well, what you're saying there makes a lot of sense, and to be honest, it's making me a little uncomfortable. I try never to make these shows about me, but I grew up in a very abusive environment, and I think I never turned violent, at least certainly not habitually, the occasional childhood scuffle and whatnot, but I more turned into kind of putting myself in a shell and insulating myself from all possible harm. And I've always had some of the symptoms you just described. Although, I'm in my 40s now and I'm far more self-aware. But Erin said something a little bit ago, and I had a very, very hard time as a man recognizing that my mother was abusive at all. And do you find that to be a common experience among your male or female people that you treat?
Absolutely. I think the idea is that the mum's physical chastisement and, emotional and verbal abuse is seen as normal to children who've grown up there because there's no sensitization, no awareness around women's aggression and the damage it does. It just seems to be normal. And the idea that mum is the most important person as you're growing up and they do all this for you. And, certainly I've seen a lot of it. I've worked in high secure mental health as well for a few years. I was on day release there. And you saw it in some of the very, very violent, disturbed men. When you looked at their files, you would find things often like stepmoms. There's quite a lot about stepfathers in the literature. The stepmothers find it equally difficult to be loving and caring to, the stepchildren. So, it's clinically there if you choose to look. It's just that often we have truly ignored female sexual abuse, verbal, emotional, and physical abuse of children and men. To the fact that most practitioners sort of believe that, children are more at risk from their fathers of physical abuse than they are from their mums, but that's not actually what the research suggests. It says it's far more equal, or even maybe mums are more aggressive and violent towards their children than dads. But that's not what practitioners believe, and it's not what the general public believes. So.
Well, it's funny that cognitive bias. I'm sorry, go ahead, Erin.
I was going to say one of the things I've always found is working with men who are extremely violent to women. The bottom of so much of it was mothers' incestuous needs for their son, or all their sons, but mostly they choose one. And I have all the evidence and I know exactly, but he will sit there and it takes an enormous amount of work to make him feel safe enough to say, yes, she abused me. Whereas they're very straightforward about their fathers. And it's, and one of the things, it's quite interesting, just men in general. There was a policeman here this week who'd come to see me over a case. And he was describing, he said, the only time I've ever been physically attacked, it's by women. And he said, and he explained this one woman had bitten him on the shoulder. And he said, well, of course, she was drunk. And I was looking at him. It wasn't actually a good time to actually say to him, yeah, but if a man had bit you, you'd have hauled him off to jail. But you see, in a way, it was almost like he ended up by saying, actually, she was a very nice woman. So, well, she can't be a very nice woman if she bites people.
Well, what is wrong with men? I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I see this so often. Men who've been abused, either intimately or otherwise, a woman has just bitten them, spit them at them, kicked them, and I've heard those very words come out of men so many times. But she's very nice. What? I'm sorry, I'm speechless. I've heard it before.
It is. Certainly in the UK we have a lot of these CCTV shows now about, the police all wear head cameras and things. So we get a lot of this thing about, drinking Britain and so forth. And it's really interesting if you just sit and watch it from a gender, looking at gender inequality. And any sort of men using any aggression is, violence is how it's, banded. And any female aggression is like drunkenness. And where women are right in the middle of it. So there was one fantastically awful clip where this woman and her, I think it looked like a mother, were assaulting this man who was trying to get away, and in the end he ended up backed up with his back against the car, and they were absolutely raining blows on him, proper, physical fist, really trying to hurt this man. And eventually he punched one of the women. And all you saw in the sort of the lead up to this show starting was this, domestic violence, and it showed this man hitting this woman. And even after, when they showed the whole reel, and it was a sustained attack, he finally hit back. They still had it framed as male brutality against women. It was really, really astounding that it could be seen like that.
But again, that's what you're talking about, brainwashing, aren't you?
Yeah.
One of the, and I think sorry about that. One of the difficulties is that if a brainwashed individual, as you say, you can show them anything you like, but the brain won't interpret. It no longer interprets normally.
Yeah, and I
this
think
is
that's what we're seeing.
I think that's true.
You said,
go ahead.
Nicola, you said something interesting there, which does have me wondering. We know that ideological feminism is a serious problem. And yes, there are women calling themselves feminists who really are genuinely good-hearted. I encountered one of them recently who was very snotty to me and sneering at me, specifically about the domestic violence issue. And I said, well, I have some things for you to read. Will you read them? And she said, fine. And she did. And she came back, and she was rather aback. I'm not telling you to say she had a road to Damascus moment, but all of a sudden, all of the snottiness was gone. And she said, you've given me some things to think about. So there's at least some hope on that end, at least for people who aren't, financially invested in the gendered model. But you said something about evolution, because I wonder sometimes if it's not all feminists' fault. Is there something in the human animal, maybe? It's just, I know I'm asking you to speculate, but is there something in the human animal, something we've evolved maybe, that people just can't perceive women as violent? I ask you to free associate on that. Yeah,
no, I mean, there's certainly a literature by Richard Felsen that looks at this idea of chivalry, where men are expected to protect women, and certainly was the whole idea of protecting women. Sort of, this is in our documented history. The idea is that you protect the women, and they're not targets in a war, and that frees up the men to go and fight. But certainly, evolutionary, it would make sense for a species such as man, a social species, for men who have the inhibition against aggressing against a woman would be far more likely to actually have a partner who survived, who had children, and who flourished, and therefore his genes would have gone on. Whereas men who saw women's provocative behaviour in the same way they would see it if a man did it, those men, if they then used aggression and, men being so much stronger than women, it makes sense that those men would actually damage their spouses, their partners, their mates, and potentially, damage their children and so forth. You could see that, aggression by a man, because he's so strong, if it was not inhibited by cues to femaleness, femininity, you could see why that would not be a good thing, and those men without that inhibition would actually be less successful evolutionary, which would suggest their genes were less likely to, go on. So you could see how it could evolve, that there is this thing that men are actually hardwired to see women as less threatening, because it allows them to then not get angry and aggress in a way that they would if a man did the same behaviour.
All right, let me ask you this. It's important. You mentioned research by a certain researcher, or did you say Richard Felsen?
Felsen, yes.
Can you spell that for me?
Felson.
Richard Felsen. All right. After today's show, I'm going to go look up and see if I can find his work. But
he is an excellent public speaker, and he's written a book, Gender and Violence Re-Examined. I think it was 2003. And that book is, honestly, if you've not read it, you've got such a treat in store for you. It is a wonderful book. And I met him at Murray Straus's conference a few years ago, and we had a very, very ardent feminist in the audience who'd sort of harangued other people as they tried to sort of show a gender-neutral approach. And when Richard Felsen came in and started talking, and I was very deeply impressed by how he presented and the way he works. He's a criminologist. And at the end, this woman who was this hardline feminist stood up and said, you've actually made me think. And I thought that was a lesson to me, because I would have said there's no way she could adapt her belief on evidence. But he was such a good speaker. he actually got through to her, and she actually seemed to take it on board, and that was probably the only time in my whole life I've seen somebody who's so ardent actually be changed, and that was by Richard Felton. So
I am going to look for that book, and you may have just given me someone I might reach out for to try and get on our show, Erin.
That'd be wonderful.
Yeah.
I see it right now. Gender and Violence Reexamined, put out by the American Psychological Association. Well,
which is like, really high esteem publisher in the world of psychology. So.
I will look into that. But yeah, I think you're making a good point there. Men who are truly prone to seriously damaging women physically are not likely to go on to have children that survive, are they? So I think there's a strong case to be made that men probably have a distinct aversion to hurting women. Yeah. And more so than they do each other. And that's not a problem necessarily, except it can be once you start seeing intimate relationships that involve violence. Because one of the things I've also read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, statistically, it appears that women are more likely to start hitting than men are.
I think.
And then when men retaliate, that's when it gets really bad. But maybe you can tell us more about what you've seen there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, so Terry Moffat, she published some work. So she's got a book out called Antisocial Sex Differences in Antisocial Behaviour, which isn't a book that you maybe bother looking at because it's not this, but she has a chapter on partner violence. So Terry Moffat is an aggression researcher. She's really eminent. She, she looks at genetics and shows she's a real hard scientist. She's way more than just psychology like myself. And May looked at this cohort study, the Dunedin study, and May actually looked at, this, and they find exactly the same. But what they find is, so for women, the easiest way to predict women's aggression is from her difficult sort of childhood, adolescent traits, which is confrontational, aggressive, and so forth. That is the strongest way to predict her partner violence, years later. But for men, the best way to predict the men's partner violence was having these difficult childhood traits as well, but the strongest one was having those traits coupled with aggression from their partner. So that suggested, but these men weren't, they may be personality disordered, they did have difficult personalities, but it's actually that extra provocation of aggression that leads them to be, domestically violent back, if you will. And obviously for a woman, I mean, I've got 4 girls, and I strongly encourage them not to use aggression, A, because it's ethically wrong to hit boys and men, but also because, while you're at school and while it might be seen as okay, there's, a lot of societal barriers to a man retaliating against a woman, but the biggest risk factor for a woman to be seriously assaulted is actually using aggression herself. So, to protect women, we need to stop them hitting men. Murray Straus has found that lots of people find that if you put women's use of aggression in any sort of analysis, that will predict her partner's use of aggression over and above the other things you tend to put in. So,
in other words, feminists and many others will gasp and become filled with rage when you'll say that a woman who's got hit was quote-unquote asking for it. Well, that's a horrible way of putting it, but if you're hitting somebody and berating them and smacking them, you are eventually going to get a violent response out of at least some people, aren't you?
Yeah, it's a highly provocative behaviour. Sorry,
can I just say something there? I'm going to ask you, Nikki, have you come across, I mean, I did certainly many, many times talking to women who are violence-prone themselves, that there's a very big sexual element in it. And you never read anything about this, or I haven't been able to find anything about it. But in many cases, for many of the women talking about it, or even the men that they were attached to, I remember saying to a man, and what happens after she has this enormous fight with you, and then he looks at you quite surprised, and he said, well, then she's hot to trot. And I said, well, have you... I know, and I don't know that anybody's looking at this, but believe me, it's a very important part of what can hold 2 people together. they're meeting each other's bad sexual needs. I mean, their needs for sadomasochism, which is well understood outside intimate partner relationships, but has never been applied behind the front door.
Yeah, I mean, it does make sense. I mean, sort of neurologically, you know, sex and violence are quite close in, you know,
so when they
closely related.
And when they cross in early childhood, because the child has been sexually abused and violently sexually abused. Thereafter, I have seen the patterns where the child continues on until it becomes an adult. And this particular woman I'm thinking of, because it's the first time it was brought to my attention, she came into the refuge, and she was a pious Catholic, perfect mother, according to her. And the husband, when he came to see me, I realized there was something very badly wrong in this. What her story she was giving me, that she was continually taken into hospital because her anus was ripped by the demands of this evil man. Actually, after she'd been in the refuge for a while, and people witnessed her behavior when she was drunk, then she and I had the conversation. And that's when she explained to me that she was only able to receive any satisfaction if she was had violent sex. And so I think from the beginning of that, it was good, because I was then able to talk to a lot of other women on a much deeper level than I had before. And I think we need to look at that.
Yeah. I was going to say, what comes across on my clinical work, you know, you start off and you read some literature and you go in and you try and do things, and it's only as things come up, isn't it, crop up, that you think, I should have been asking that right at the beginning.
Exactly.
And I've never thought to ask that. I can certainly see why that high arousal, which comes with aggression, you know, the passion, and you know, that sort of that passionate, that, you know, lots of heart pumping and everything else. I can see why that would be related to sex as well. And I think there is a paper about women who, obviously it's from a feminist perspective, it was women who were victims of domestic violence reported having more sex than women who weren't, and it was explained in a feminist way as like sort of sexual coercion, you know, that men use violence to make women not want to say no to sex. But I read it from an evolutionary perspective and think, well, yeah, equally it could be something quite different, really. And what you're saying is maybe it is. Yeah.
Well, I was just talking to several women. The two that stand out, she was an international journalist, married to another international journalist. He was very famous. And she came to see me, and I got to know her. And I just remember saying, well, why are you with this guy? I mean, he's a nightmare. She said, it's the best rough sex I've ever had. Yeah. And that was mirrored by a woman in the refuge. She was from Scotland. And she just sat down and she said, Erin, I will stay here with my children, and I'll get rehoused until such time as they're off my hands. Then I'll go back to him. Same thing. I said, why on earth? I said, best rough sex. So I think we should really begin to look at that, because that's something that it's a glue that holds people together.
Well, you're talking about a very taboo subject there that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. Yet,
good.
Yes. Well, but if it's about treating people who need help, you know, I mean, if you go to a doctor, they're going to have to go up your rectum and, you know, and do other things that are very uncomfortable, because that's what's needed to help somebody. I'm trying to imagine trying to help pregnant women if you weren't allowed to, you know, help a pregnant woman through labor if you weren't allowed to actually look at her nethers. I mean, silly, right? Well, so if you're going to help women or men, and there's something uncomfortable, like recognizing that there's a sexual element, you're going to have to do it if you're going to make progress, aren't you?
Yeah. Well, it's such a relief. I mean, the times a woman have said to me, nobody ever asked me that question. It's like if you were saying, Nikki. And I remember just saying to this woman who had been in therapy all her life, I said, but why didn't you tell your therapist? And she said, because she never asked me the right question. The therapist didn't give her permission to be able to say, you know, this is what happens. And we have to, there's an awful lot more work and research, because actually, if you think about it, Nikki, it's a very new subject. It's only 40-something years old.
Yeah.
That we've there's no literature. Before I opened the refuge, I looked everywhere for literature on anywhere in the world that would help me, because I was suddenly faced with this, understanding it as I did personally, but I needed help. There was nothing I could find. That's why I wrote Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear, because there was nothing at that time. There's quite a bit about battered children, about children who are victims of violence, but nothing about the family or what was going on behind front doors. And that's extraordinary, that whole topic, which everybody knew, all the agencies knew, had been kept silent for thousands of years, if you think about it.
Absolutely. I mean, something you sort of pick up in the literature a little bit, not really explicit, but I don't know if you remember the Tracy Andrews case where she killed her fiancé and said it was a road rage. Do you remember?
Yes, I do. I do.
Yeah. Well, I read a book about her, and it was something I thought may probably be something that is quite salient to understanding men in relationships with sort of violent women, is that she was, quite, very sort of highly sexed, if you will. And, because women aren't socialised, or for whatever reason, women tend to be the gatekeepers in sex, it must be quite nice for a guy, to see a young guy, to have a woman who's, always up for it, up for different things, sexually, aggressive in way, that she initiates and wants to do these things. Yeah. And I honestly, I wonder, and I've wondered this for some time, that how far, because this is something they sort of felt that kept this, her fiancé, Lee Harvey, who she killed, kept him going back to a relationship, and in the relationship, was this sort of like sexual chemistry. Yeah. And how much are women able to use that hook to hook men in and to keep them, keep them in a relationship that, although it's aggressive, it's actually very sexually stimulating as well, just because they're getting a lot of sex, but the
answer to everybody who's going to get shocked and outraged is, why are 50 million women reading Shades of Grey, and across the world that book outsold everything, including the Bible, which is fairly shocking, that 50 Shades of Grey. So it shows how many women are into this sort of stuff.
I haven't read it, but that book is almost all rape and sexual violence.
It's soft porn. It's nothing like the real thing. You see, this is the thing. Most women's sexual fantasies, however violent they are, it is a fantasy. It's when the women actually deal with the reality of it. Most women would turn away. But there are certainly many women in the refuge and women that I've dealt with who, for them, it was the biggest turn-on ever.
Yeah, well, I do. I think it goes back to, and you picked up on this right at the beginning about the violence-prone women and about these adverse childhood experiences. And I think certainly, again, the sexual aggression literature is very gendered. There's some great people in it now, like Tony Beach, Tony Ward, people who are trying to actually see male sexual offenders as people and everything else. Yeah. And that's quite gendered, but we know with boys who are sexually abused as children, there is a tendency for that to become eroticized, and that's, absolutely. And it is something that there is evidence for. And they always say for women it makes them victims. I am not convinced of that. I just think, again, it's a feminist interpretation of the data. I think having early experiences, like you said, of violence and sexual abuse, it sets up for certain, connections in the mind, certain things that because highly arousing.
Yeah, and I'm not allowed to, I obviously can't say this because I'm not in any way qualified to say it, but I can say that I did notice, right the way through all the work I've done, I've always noticed how binding the sexual needs of each other, of people, men and women, once they fuse, how very, very dangerous it is, because it transcends everything else, including their ability to parent.
Yes.
Neurologically,
sex is a very powerful thing. The oxytocin release, the orgasm, and everything else. It's one of the best drugs you can have. So, we shouldn't be surprised that people get hooked on something which is bad for them, but makes them feel good.
But the treatment program I had was to say to the woman, okay, you look at what's happening between you and him. He's your drug pusher. He's the heroin pusher. The only way to get rid of him so that you don't have to die, and some did die, was to actually go cold turkey.
Yeah.
And in order to do that, you need a big community around you. And those were the second stage houses where they shared with each other. So they weren't put out into the cold on their own with this overwhelming urge to go back. Because that's why women get hated by the police and social workers and everybody else. They get so hostile because she keeps going back.
Absolutely. And yet the problem is they do not understand why the woman is in the first place. There's this silly, simplistic conceptualization, but you stumble into a violent relationship, and that can happen, do not get me wrong, but you remain in it because you honestly are afraid he will kill you if you try and leave. Now, I'm not saying that, I actually think when you get to that point, women do leave. I think it's before that you don't leave. And a lot of the reasons why, these women, when they're rescued, go back is because they've got, they've had difficult upbringings. They've got a difficult personality. They have, they have triggers and reinforcers that come from their learning history. And to just say, we've rescued you, you're safe, is completely letting them down. We need to find out what is it, what function does that serve, why, what is it that you're getting, which is worth having, even though you're afraid, you love your children and you can't, but you don't seem to be able to prioritise them. What is it that what is the barrier to not going back? But nobody, they sort of say, well, he's this and he's a, controlling pig and everything else. But they're not, they never really seem to be listening to what the woman says.
No, well, she wouldn't be able to say it in the refuge anyway, very honestly.
No.
Because anyway, most of them are filtered. The women who have drug problems, problems of aggression and violence, and alcohol problems don't get into the refuges, and if they do, they're evicted. Yeah. So those are the women who most need us. That's the bit that really hurts me. I did a project in Brixton a couple of years ago, working with mothers on the verge of losing their children, because social services... And my argument was, please, why can't you do what I did? Take the mothers in, mother the mothers, so they can mother their children. But nobody will listen. So we keep taking the children away. The women keep reproducing more children, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. But nobody cares, because there's no votes in it.
I know. I mean, the thing is, there would be votes in it if the media could be brave and could stand up and actually start talking about family violence being a family issue often, and actually say... It is, actually step up and do its job, which is to inform the public, but it could be different, but I honestly believe the media is just very, very lazy, and they go along with the stories now which are fed to them through, these news agencies and so forth.
But also, you have to remember, but most of the women journalists are radical feminists. So that's what you're going to get. I mean, look at last week. We had this big splurge about how the police have failed women, the victims, and how they failed miserably. And no mention ever of men. It was all women as victims. Well, the usual things trotted out. 2 women a week die. Nobody mentions the 1 man. Nobody mentions the suicide rates. It's like there's a terrible silence hanging over one half of this massive problem.
Yes, absolutely. It's just crazy. I mean, you look at, say, the British Crime Survey, and they have figures like something like, 42% of women injured are injured because of their partner, but only 7% of men injured are injured through their partner. And I use these in my lectures at UCLan, and I say, so what does that say? And the students say, well, that means domestic violence is a lot bigger problem for women. And I said, no, the problem with this stat is, and I said, it's the only time they ever use this sort of analysis, is you are comparing how many men are injured in an intimate relationship, what proportion of all men injured are injured in a relationship, compared to what proportion of all women injured are injured in a relationship. But the problem with men is men are far more likely to be injured, like by strangers, by other men and everything else. So you've got a much bigger number, and it looks like really small, doesn't it? But for women, we're quite protected. We're unlikely to be injured by anybody, unless it's somebody we know and, and so forth. So they deliberately manipulate the figures and make a very dishonest, statistically accurate, but a dishonest representation of the data, and they only do it for domestic violence. They don't ever do it for anything else. They wouldn't do it if they were looking at race, or disability. Dare. They wouldn't do it with anything like that. They only they just do it with men.
But who, Nicola, this is the $64,000 question. Who and when and where is this going to be exposed? Because it's a dark ages in terms of family life. In the last 40 years, we have seen more damage done to the family and to men and to boys than probably we ever have in history, if you think about it. Marriage is centuries old, and it's now almost virtually becoming extinct.
No, I understand. I truly believe that we have politicians who are obviously self-interested, so they're happy to be, feathering their own nests, and so therefore they pander to the crowd, and to feminists and sort of thing. So they're not interested. They're not going to do it. Feminists, of the ones who are getting a lot of more or are very ideologically sort of based, they're probably not going to be in position to move this forward. But the people on the ground, but the people on the ground, literally, I came into this whole research as a feminist. It was only through the research that I changed. There are enough people on the ground who are, I think, starting to, really question these models. And I think what's going to happen, like we've got Respect, haven't we, accrediting domestic violence programs in the UK, and it's a gender-based analysis, sort of Duluth and so forth.
All of it,
but what's happening is people contact me and other people like Louise Dixon in Birmingham, and they talk to us, and we just say, well, try sort of this model or that model, or, and we develop programs. And what happens is, for people who actually care, and there's a lot of people on the grassroots who do care, they're just going to go round the likes of Respect. They're just going to go round and do something that's evidence-based. And eventually they'll look round and they'll think they've got control. They'll look round and everybody will be completely ignoring them, and they will be redundant. I think that's the point at which things will really change in a big way, when it becomes, by default, everybody's already doing something different, and they then at the top, they have to then sort of look around and say, it's safe to come out, and actually say, maybe that's not feminism isn't a model. I hope.
Yeah.
I think that's happening. I believe it's a generational issue. I suspect, but I see more and more people on the ground all the time, just as you just mentioned. I also keep getting contacted now and then privately by women through things like LinkedIn and a few other places on social media who contact me confidentially. They tell me they're in the profession. They really don't like what they're seeing, and they appreciate the work we do on A Voice for Men and this show with Erin and stuff like that. I think that younger generation of people, as the gray hairs, the feminist ideologues who gave us the Duluth Model and other garbage like that, as they go into retirement, we may start to see a snowball of change. I at least certainly hope to God that happens. I did have a note here to ask you about something. You mentioned the Duluth Model. This is the one feminists rely on primarily, right? It's the one that presumes that the problem of domestic violence is the controlling patriarchal male who must dominate his submissive, or make his wife submissive, which we know is garbage. Right, it has no scientific validity whatsoever. But you did mention in a private conversation to me something I've heard about before, and in fact we had him on the show once, the conflict tactics scale by Murray Straus. Is that a tool you used and found effective?
I always use the conflict tactics scale in all of my research, in all of my clinical work. I always recommend it to other people. I use a 1979 version, the old version, which just looks at negotiation, verbal and physical aggression, and I tend to only like the physical aggression subscale. But that asks about what you do and what your partners do. So I'm running a program in a prison, and all the men at intake complete with conflict tactics scale, and it asks them, what have you done and what has your partner done? Then I'd have a separate control and behaviour scale, because control is important, and we have the same thing. And the lovely thing about using it clinically is it sets it up straight away. So the men know, and some of the men who are on my program have done previous Duluth-based programs in the prison system before. It says immediately, we haven't got a problem with you saying your partner's violent. We're working with you, and so, there's no point wasting a whole session saying how awful your partner is. We have to work out what your needs are, why you're still there, they're so awful, and what's probably best for you. But certainly, using the conflict tactics scale clinically, it's well known for research, but clinically, it's really good because it gets that message across saying it's not just one person, it's what have you both done. And it works really well.
one of the reasons I'm finding talking to you so fascinating is that on this show we've generally had two kinds of guests, either pure clinical researchers like Murray Straus, or Dr. Tara Palmatier, who's done no clinical research. She has a PsyD degree, and all she does is deal with primarily men who've dealt with it. You've done a little bit of both, and to me that makes your insights particularly powerful.
I agree.
It's been I've been very lucky in my university has been very generous with its time, and it's allowed me to, essentially it's, allowed me to take a day a week off for 4 years to actually work clinically. And I thought what I was doing, I wanted to work clinically because I was frustrated that the research, that we discussed, wasn't making it into practitioners. They didn't know about it, and I thought, well, of course they haven't got access to the articles. They're written quite turgid and academic, and so I thought I will go and I'll take it across to them. But what I never anticipated, and what I've been really happy to be, surprised by, is how much I've learned from them, which I've then brought back into my research. So I'm really interested in, trauma, childhood trauma, how that fits in, emotional regulation skills, and distress tolerance. And these things have come from my clinical work. And emotional language and things like that. You see it clinically and you think that's interesting. When you go and look at the literature, and it's this real symbiotic relationship. It's really anyone who could do it, I would recommend doing both if you can.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right.
It's really neat to see, and I hope you publish more on what you've seen in your clinical research. And I do know we do have others who listen to this, so if you're a psychologist or social worker or whatever, Dr. Kevan just strongly recommended something called the conflict tactics scale. You feel the 1979 version in particular is superior to later versions? Do you know where people would get that?
The 1979 version is published in, I can't remember what journal it is, but Murray Straus, who's got a web page and everything else, he actually has a copy of, I'm almost positive his original paper, which is 1979, is on his website and free to download. I just find it superior because all I want to use it for is to look at the physical aggression. Now, the later one, the conflict tactics scale 2, includes sexual aggression, injuries, and coercive control. And that's fine, but if I use a separate control scale anyway, and if I'm interested in other aspects, I would actually use a scale specifically designed to measure the other things. Then
what I'll do is, just for anybody who's listening, either live or in the archives or on YouTube, the conflict tactics scale, it's Professor Murray A. Straus, Murray A. Straus. Straus is spelled with one S on the end. S-T-R-A-U-S. If you go into Google, you'll find him. He's a professor at the University of New Hampshire. Professor of sociology there, and I'm looking at his webpage now, and there's the conflict tactics scales, free to download and look at and use in your own clinical work if that's the kind of work you do. So I'm glad we were.
And they've also got the. I was going to say they've also got on his website. He's got the relationship profile questionnaire, it calls something like that, and that's got lots of items for looking at personality disorder, childhood abuse, but nice short ones. Because you want to learn a lot of things, but you can't have somebody there for 3 hours filling in questionnaire. So he's got a relationship profile questionnaire, something it's called, and it's got all these different things, so you can actually look and think, well, I'm interested in asking these several things. And there's some nice, really short little scales you can use.
Excellent. Well, we're getting near to where we want to start wrapping the show up. Erin, did you have anything else you wanted to ask Nikki about?
No, except I'm so really pleased to have had this time with you, Nikki. It's so comforting because I'm not really aligned to any academics or any other group, so it's quite lonely out there, and it's just so heartwarming to hear how much work is being doing. And I agree with you. I think the time will come when things will change, and we'll look back and wonder how whole populations were brainwashed into this appalling hatred of men and boys and family life.
Absolutely.
And Dr. Kevan, you mentioned to me, Erin had done an intake information on the original 100 women who came into our refuge all the way back in the 70s and could never get it published. Didn't you tell me that you were one of the ones who helped get that information put into a peer-reviewed journal?
Yes, Erin and I met in Sacramento. Was it 2008?
That's right. Yeah.
John Hamill's conference. And Erin it was so sweet because when she came in, everyone clapped and stood up. And she said, you said the last time everyone stood up, they walked out. And it was so nice for you to actually be somewhere where everybody was, supportive. But we got to chatting, didn't we? And you said, I said, this information, I've seen it on web pages. I said, is it published anywhere? And you said you hadn't been able to. And I said, find where you've got a copy and send it to me, and we'll get it published in the Journal of Aggression, Conflict and Peace Research.
Where is it again?
It's the Journal of Aggression, Conflict and Peace Research. It's one that the editors are at UCLan. I used to be an editor. The current editor at UCLan is Professor Jane Ireland and Michelle Davis as well. But that paper got published there, and it was just so nice finally to get it in print. And reading it as an editor, I was just looking at it thinking, you came into it from a practitioner perspective, but the things you saw, the way you measure violence prone, and I use it in my lectures, I use it in talks I give at conferences as well, what you saw intuitively, because you were seeking to understand rather than confirm what you already knew, it's got such legs. The research that we're looking at now with trauma and everything, it's what you were saying so many years ago. And, you say it's nice. Yeah, you say it's nice to hear, about all this research, but, it really wouldn't have happened without people like yourselves, in the UK and the US, and, and Murray Straus and these few brave people who took amazing amount of stick, and for nothing but personal, you got nothing really positive from it, other than it must be the tenacity of you all to actually dig in and say, no, I'm not going to go away. And it's only because of people like yourselves that we're where we are now, so you should be rightfully proud of what you've achieved. You pioneers.
I know, and I'm very, very grateful to Voice for Men, because it's the first time I found anywhere, online or anywhere, a group of people who genuinely were also stuck in, and didn't matter how many people they upset, they live and breathe what they believe. And that's very comforting.
Sometimes we have to be rude, but if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. The paper we're talking about, if anybody wants to find it in Google or whatever, it's called Practice Report, a comparative study of battered women and violence-prone women by Erin Pizzey. You'll find it very easily, and it's from the Journal of Aggression, Conflict, and Peace Research, Volume 1, Issue 2, published July 2009. There you go. I have that. I want to ask you both about one more thing. Nicola, you said you are going to be presenting at a conference in Amsterdam or something?
I am, yes, in Amsterdam in June. I've just had my confirmation that they've accepted my paper. It's the European Conference on Positive Psychology, and I'm going to be talking about, so the men I've got the program running with, we've used a strengths-based positive psychology approach with these men, where we recognise that they've got strengths and, that they have merit in their own right. We've adopted a very clinical and evidence-based approach, and we've run 5 cohorts now. So we've had 40 men through. We've lost one man who failed a drug test in the prison, so it wasn't particularly related to the actual program. He was taken off for that reason. And besides him, we haven't lost anybody at all. And I'm going to be talking about the psychometric questionnaires we've done pre and post, and and what the program says to me, what it proves, and I think we're already beginning to know this in the clinical literature, is if you treat people who perpetrate domestic violence like humans, with issues that can be resolved, but they're not evil or wholly bad, and you treat them well and with respect, and you help them understand their behaviour and put skills into to make a different decision and choice next time. It really, you can engage them and it can work, and that's what frustrates me most about this treatment approach of Duluth, is it's dishonest. It's dishonest for everybody because it doesn't work, and you're wasting people's time. At very best, you're just wasting their time. But at worst, you're making people feel hopeless. So.
But this is an alternative to the failed Duluth model that you're talking about. What was the name of the conference again?
It's the European Conference on Positive Psychology.
Now, I assume that's not for the general public per se, but it's for practitioners, clinicians,
researchers. It's a practitioner.
But you will be presenting there, and you have a paper there on this issue that they've accepted. That's great. Do you happen to know if it'll be recorded at all?
I don't know, actually. I can ask them, and if it is, I'll email you a link and let you know.
Oh, that would be great, because we'd be happy to publish it. We want to do everything we can to make the general public and people working in the field know that this sort of thing is going on. And because it's important that we break the Duluth model, we break the gendered paradigm, and that's not going to happen unless a lot of people at the grassroots start to recognize the gendered model, the Duluth model, is bogus, and domestic violence will never get better as long as we keep these failed strategies to address it. Off my hobby horse. Also, Erin, you're going to be presenting to a conference in Portugal this year?
Yes, my health isn't strong enough for me to make the journey there, but I will do it. I will Skype. Yeah, I will do it on Skype. Yeah, very, very, very interested group of people in Portugal, and I'm looking forward to talking to them.
Do you recall the name of that conference?
I haven't got the dates or the final things, but I'll let you know when I do.
So we'll make sure to let our listeners know about that. I imagine Nikki might be curious about it, too.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So, all right, Dr. Kevan, Nikki, anything else you'd like to, any parting words of wisdom you'd like to leave us with?
No, I just say keep doing what you're doing. You're doing an excellent job, and it's a thankless job at times, but I really do think that most people are not biased in this way. Most people are just unaware, and that by raising awareness, you're going to actually help everybody. So just keep going.
Oh, thank you so much. Our honored guest today has been Dr. Nicola Graham-Kevan, who's with both Sweden University and University of Central Lancashire. Thank you, Nicola. I'll also just remind everybody again, we'll be here next week with Tales from the Infrared in this time zone where we talk about geek culture and science and things like that. And in 2 weeks, we don't have our guest lined up yet, although I'm hoping for Richard Gillies. We'll see. Stay tuned. Want to say goodnight to everybody, Erin?
Yeah, I'd love to. Good night, everybody. Take care.
Hey, James, take us home.
You have been listening to Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and me, her co-host, Dean Esme. Our show's opening music and closing music is known as Sunshine and Eternal Hope, respectively, and is by Kevin MacLeod and used under Creative Commons Attribution License, with a link in the show notes. We also want to thank James Huff and Paul Elam, and all of those who are part of the A Voice for Men community for their support for this show. Remember, if you're a victim of domestic violence, no matter if you're a man or a woman, gay or straight, adult or child, no matter what your race, your ethnicity, your religious views, your sexual orientation, or anything else, what you went through or are going through now is not okay. You should not be afraid to talk about it with people who understand and care. Just remember to talk to people who do understand and not to ideologues who fear the truth or will marginalize you and your experiences. Remember, the truth about domestic abuse is often painful to hear, especially to ideologues, and especially to those who've been through it and been marginalized and ignored. But remember, in truth, there is hope and healing. And we hope you'll be a part of helping to spread the truth and the healing. Please join us next time on Domestic Violence Revelations with Erin Pizzey and yours truly, Dean Esme. God bless.